Thank you for joining our session this morning on addressing and eliminating sexual harassment and how you can make a difference. I'm Rhonda Brewer with BCD Meetings and Events, and have been leading up the Women in Leadership group within SITE, and have partnered with Amanda Armstrong through the Events Industry Sexual Harassment Task Force that we are both leading, to be able to share the results of this survey with you today. Amanda, would you like to introduce yourself, and then we'll get into a little poll before we get started?
Of course. Thanks, Rhonda. Yes, happy to be presenting with you and to our audience today. My name is Amanda Armstrong, and I am the Assistant Vice President for the Meetings and Travel Department with Enterprise Holdings, which is the parent company for Enterprise Rent-A-Car National and Alamo. And my volunteer job is I was the 2018 on the board of directors for MPI. I was their chair. And Rhonda and I started on this Events Industry Sexual Harassment Task Force 2 years ago, as we felt that this was a really important industry issue, and we wanted to spread awareness and education. And so part of that is by bringing some webinars to the industry, and that's what we're doing here today.
Thank you. Okay, before we launch into the results of our survey, we are going to have two quick polls for you. Erin, if we can launch the first poll. The first poll is actually, do you have a policy at your place of work that addresses how to handle sexual harassment? And I know there's not many of us. Does it look like all the answers are in, Erin?
Yes, we are good. I'll end the poll now. It looks like 67% say not yet, but they're working on it, and one person says no.
Okay, great, thank you. And then the next one is, do you have a policy in place for your events that addresses how to handle sexual harassment? All right, and what are the results there, Erin?
Yeah, so right now we have 67% say yes, and 33% say not yet, but they're working on it.
That's good to know. Okay, so diving in to our presentation, I wanted to kind of give you the background on where this got started. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a Women in Leadership group that was formed 2 years ago out of SITE, and one of the things we wanted to do was understand the issues that women face in general within our industry. So we did a poll last year, and one of the things that really came out was this aspect of sexual harassment. So this year we actually dove into it a little bit further, because we don't want to just poll and see what's happening. We want to be able to understand how we can really make a difference and stop what's going on, or what are those preventative measures that we can put in place to deal with the situation. So that's really what we did this year with this survey and the results that we're going to be sharing. So we had 141 female respondents that came back from our email survey that went out. And of that, we'll look at the next slide, 79% of those were actually within the North American region, followed by Europe, Latin America, and Asia Pacific. So the good news here is that we really did have a cross-section of respondents from across the globe. Ideally, we want to be able to expand that a little bit further, and we're going to work on that in the future. But unfortunately, we did have, you know, this is an issue across the board that we need to address. So from the demographics of it, 38% were actually baby boomers, and then we went into Gen X and millennials. So, or I'm sorry, actually it was Gen X first, and then baby boomers and millennials. So they were all pretty much across the board. So we didn't have one group that was responded more. It was pretty much across the board. So we did get a broad range of respondents. And then we had where everybody was working was primarily third parties, followed by hotels, corporate, and then other, which really consists of like crews and consultants within the industry, and then DMC. So again, another good cross-section of job discipline. Lastly, around demographics, we wanted to know who they really worked for. Were they large companies? Were they small companies? And primarily about 65% were from larger companies, followed by micro, which was fewer than 10, small, which is 10 to 49, and then medium, which was 50 to 249. So we really did see a lot of these respondents coming back out of the larger companies. And then almost half of them have been in the industry for almost 20 years. So that's a big representation. Like, they've been in the industry, they've seen a lot, and are able to really respond to this. And then as far as what roles they play within their organization, and I think that links directly back to the number of years they've been in place, the majority of them were in management and executive leadership owners. And then we went into more mid-level to top leadership. So a great cross-section, and I think it was a good foundation for getting the right information that we need in order to be able to address this situation.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, you know, when we looked at who we polled, we were really happy with those results because we want this to be representative as far as the data. So what did they say? And I think this validated what we have all assumed ever since #MeToo came out, and all of the stats that we've been reading throughout all the other industries. The events industry is equally as affected. So as you can see here, we've got 4 out of every 10 females had unwanted sexual advancements from a customer or from a colleague. We wanted to include those two because with the suppliers, that seems to be a customer advance. It seemed to be something that they had to deal with. And then colleagues would be peer-to-peer. And then nearly half the women surveyed had been sexually harassed, either physically or verbally, during their career. So I think what this slide to us said is that this is absolutely happening. It's basically half of all women have entertained a sexual advance or have been propositioned or been harassed. And actually, when you look at harassment, sexual advance fits inside sexual harassment. So I think we wanted to break this down and to validate the data here, and that's what it reports. On the next slide, when we look at you know, have women ever used their sexuality to advance their career? That they have not. So 98% said that is not what they're looking to do. And so that was, you know, good to report on. And then over half women felt they've been harassed or bullied by another woman in their workplace. So I think this kind of speaks to the general aspect of harassment, that it can come from man or woman or non-binary or non-identifying, but harassment in the workplace can happen and can be from anyone. And so I think this was an important thing to look at as we're looking at the landscape of where is harassment coming from. And it can be through sexual advancements. It also can be in the form of bullying. So on this slide, I think that when we looked at some of the verbatims, there was quite a few things about not selling yourself short and finding the confidence here in your own abilities and your skills and contributions. And the way that kind of took this is that you know, when there's a harassment issue, I think a lot of times, and I can speak from, you know, personal experience, there's a bit of self-doubt when something happens about, you know, why is this happening? And you know, and was it solicited? And did I misread cues? And I think for this, it's find the confidence to make sure that you know that your skill set is what got you in that room, and your contributions are what are valued. And so I think remembering that during a time of harassment or bullying or a sexual advance is really important. And then the bottom thing is, what do you do next? And I think Rhonda and I have talked about this at other webinars that we've given and other talks about your resources and your relationships being such an important part of the next steps, because you do have peers, mentors, advocates, as well as your HR department. And those should all be consulted if you feel like you're in a harassment or a sexual harassment or a regular harassment situation at work, in the workplace, or at an event.
Thank you, man. And I think you bring up a great point. It's having the confidence to know that it's not right and being able to address it in the areas you need to. One of the next survey results was asking respondents if they had been sexually harassed or harassed in general. Have you ever approached HR? And I think it's unfortunate that, more than half of them, almost 60%, had never approached HR. And I think, some of that is within your own company is having those policies in place to be able to know that there's a process that you can go through to be able to report it accordingly. And that's really the important thing. On the next slide, we're actually going to see a couple of different thoughts that people shared about what they did do if it happened to them. And one person just said, I did speak to HR directly, however, it wasn't taken seriously and they left the business, which is unfortunate. And I think that's why it's important to have those policies in place and be able to state the facts and what has happened and how it's, it's not okay with you and that it needs to be addressed from an internal perspective. Unfortunately, one didn't go to HR because they thought of it as a drunken incident, and it's not an excuse and you still need to address it accordingly. Remove myself from the situation and not let it affect me. And I think that, getting away from the situation is absolutely a great step to take so they're not in that environment. And then, taking a stance to say, you know what, no, this is not going to happen, and I'm strong enough to be able to stand up against it. And then again, I handled it myself and I drew the boundary not to be crossed. So you do have to have the confidence to be able to say no and to know that it's okay to walk away.
Yeah, I just want to, on that one, I think that for me, I think the majority of women that I've spoken to that have been in a situation fall into that I handled it myself, I drew a boundary, and I moved on. And I think that while that may have been the culture in the past, I think what we don't think about is that that is a one-on-one situation between you and whoever was the encounter was with. It doesn't speak to that when you don't raise the alarm or go to HR or do some peer-to-peer coaching, that incident will continue on maybe in perpetuity with other people, because you are handling it one-on-one. And if it didn't fly with you, then the next person will be propositioned or harassed. So I think, and this is a lesson that I personally learned when I didn't go to HR on a harassment issue, is that you can handle it and it can end for you, but that doesn't mean that it won't be an issue for someone else. And so thinking about what is the next person's situation going to be like if I don't raise this to the appropriate person or I don't address it, in an appropriate way, it could continue on after your experience is over.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the other piece is it's not just about HR, it's in events. So if we're at an event, especially an industry event, having the knowledge to be able to know who to go to be able to report it if it's at an event, we need to be able to do that too. I know SITE has something in place, MPI has something in place to be able to report should a situation be handled, because we want people to be able to continue to come and feel confident in those situations that harassment is not allowed, and we want to make sure that we address it head on as opposed to allowing it to continue. So the next question we asked was, do you think the nature of the hospitality industry and the availability of alcohol makes women in this industry more vulnerable to unwanted advances? And this is a tough one because it's around our industry at every turn, and 77% said yes and maybe. So I think this gets into, it's going to continue. I think everybody continues to have alcohol at the various events. It's making sure that should a situation start getting beyond control, the best, in my opinion, is to be able to get yourself out of that situation and not continue down. It's not that you can drive you can't change some people's behavior. We can address it, and we're going to continue to address it head on, and you need to be able to walk away and report those types of situations should that occur.
So this next slide, what should we, so we've given you kind of the, is it an issue? Yes. Are people affected by it? Yes, over half. And are people taking it to HR? The majority are not. And so is it happening in events? Absolutely. Is it going to? Yes. So what do we do? And I think part of why we formed this task force and why SITE and MPI have done training and awareness is because we really need to mobilize our industry. And I think that we're at a really important spot to do that because our industry touches so many others. And so for this, when we kind of looked at the participants and what they said, they had a lot of interesting comments on what's next, what do we do? And I think that, in these boxes, there was a great comment about including men on the discussion and being part of the conversation, because that is a big part. And I think there are a lot of task force out there, including MPI women, that have opened up the task force and the conversation to men in our industry, to be able to get their perspective. And I think within companies and also within events teams, having men be a part of the conversation is pretty critical, just to have balanced perspective. I think also having solid policies and a zero tolerance attitude has been the way that this task force has, we have a zero tolerance attitude, and anyone who's a part of the task force, which are several associations and IMAX, that it is a zero tolerance. And what does that mean for each organization? It's a little different. I think it does mean that it's addressed, it's vetted, it's investigated, and then it is either the member or the attendee is asked to, no longer participate in the organization or the body, or as a volunteer. I mean, it takes a lot of different formats, but having a zero tolerance attitude and policies that reflect it, that takes a little bit of time to develop. So that's, I think, a bit of where we want to go next with an industry and with our individual organizations and companies. There was also some talk about education, and starting really this education from the very beginning. And when you do that, you kind of create a culture of professionalism, and respect, and also knowledge. If this happens to you or to someone that you support or report to, what happens? What's the next step? And I think when you talk about it, it's a little less scary as maybe a new employee that might experience that in the workplace or in an event. And the last thing was just open dialogue about the challenges between men and women, and then equality, talking about equality in your worth, in the education and training that's offered. So a lot of great pieces of advice from these participants on what they want to see moving forward. And I think this really models and echoes what we've been doing as a task force and what many of our organizations have put in place over the last year to address this. So on the event manager side, we decided to break down, all right, let's get specific. So, the last slide was really about policies and org awareness and education. As an event manager, what would your role be? So in speaking from this side, I think the questions that we've listed here on the left are the first things to ask. A code of conduct at meetings can, and many of you might have seen this or either have it implemented, but this can exist on your website, or it can exist at registration. But it is basically, it can be a 3 quick sentences or less about, what is appropriate at this meeting, as far as the expectations of behavior, and how you're going to treat people, and what you're signing up for. And when you have if you have it on your registration site, attendees can check the box. It can be mandatory, so they are opting in. And this helps because, one, it sets expectations from the beginning, but it also is a point to go back to if you have someone that violates this code of conduct. This would be grounds for if they're no longer welcome at your event, or if it feeds into an investigation. They've committed and were aware of what the expectations of behavior were before attending this meeting. And so if they were to violate it, it would be used in kind of the investigation. It would be really strong evidence that you were very clear on what was going to be appropriate. I think the third point here is something that we've had at Enterprise that has been really helpful. Not only do we do the code of conduct and the registration opt-in, but we also send a specific message when we're building up anticipation around the event, telling them we're excited for them to be there, here's what's coming your way. We also include a very serious paragraph about code of conduct and behavior and treating each other right and respectfully at the meeting. And it is really speaking to the fact that we are serving alcohol, and we do notice that at events with alcohol, you have a higher degree and incident rate, a higher incident rate. So we really want to speak to, although we're having fun and we're enjoying networking and connecting, that we really do have an expectation level for behavior. And then the last point here is, when something like this happens at your event, what is your protocol for handling it and who's involved? So that will take some conversations with HR or your meeting sponsor, or your division head. Whoever the decision makers are should be involved in that process, along with HR if that's how your organization is set up, just to make sure that you're doing all the right things and in the right order, and handling it, from a professional or even a legal standpoint. You want to make sure all those boxes are checked. So that's kind of how we kind of came up with, are you ready? And then on the right side, what are your next steps? And it's really just the mirror of, identifying your thought partners, starting to write a code of conduct. You can introduce it at the next meeting and see how it goes. And then discuss attendee communication options, because I think, who would someone that was harassed go to? Would they go to the reg desk? Are your reg desk folks ready for that type of an inquiry? Would they go to an officer or maybe an organizer of the event that they know? So I think really briefing your team on where these conversations might pop up and how they're supposed to handle them. And then asking HR to assist on site with protocol at events. I spoke to that earlier. That's to get your game plan in order, because I think, coming from my experience, I'm not a lawyer, and I did not know, what are the appropriate questions to ask? When do you need to call law enforcement? What are victim rights? Those are a lot of questions that I had, and our HR professionals were able to handle those questions, quite well, and give us a good game plan going forward.
Great. And then for the supplier side, because again, we're all in this together. So we all need to have a plan, whether you're a planner or whether you're a supplier, whether it be CVB, DMC, hotel, or cruise. So, for you, or are you ready there as well? And how can you help your clients? So what have you done and put in place that should something happen on a cruise ship or in your hotel or at a venue that the DMC is sponsoring, what's the protocol that you're going to be able to use to be able to handle that? Can you share the code of conduct that you've seen, and so they know that you're ready to be able to address that same issue? And then next steps, it's, ask your clients how you can help. So are you really, have you worked with them? Do they have it addressed? To me, I think it's a great question to start, any site inspection. Or started at some point, you need to ask the question, should this happen? How are you ready to address it? And I think it's the same with, emergency situations. You need to know where the emergency exits are. You need to have a plan in place for all the variety of situations that can come out. And this is one of them that needs to be addressed as well. You need to discuss your attendee communication options. So how do they need to be able to approach it? I think, Amanda hit it on the head, is that you have to be able to show a code of conduct and say, this is how we're addressing it, and this is how we're handling it within our own hotel and with employees or within your DMC. So they know that they have to be able to address it within there as well as the customer. And then review what support you have available. So how can you really help them from a support perspective? So again, I think it's just, if you look back at it, we're all responsible to be able to address that, and we need to have the right protocols in place in order to be able to address that. And then lastly, we got to set the example. So you know what, we need to start with, how can we figure out how we can eliminate this as a whole? Because it would be great if there were no harassment whatsoever, whether it be sexual harassment or bullying or whatever it is. It's just not tolerated. And I think, earlier we talked about, 50% of the women have been harassed by other women. And we really need to support each other and not have the bullying piece of it. We have to be able to bring each other up and be able to be happy if somebody gets a promotion or somebody's moving on, or not try and stop somebody from being able to get to their goals. But we also have a responsibility to do it in the right way. So if we can all collaborate together, both men and women, we'll all just have a much better work environment across the board and within our industry. I love this one, and Amanda says this one a lot. If you see something, say something. Like, it's not okay, and if it's going on there, it's going to continue. And if you see it, you need to stop it in its tracks, and we need to be able to make sure that it's being addressed. Peer-to-peer coaching, I think this is really important. We actually started an Advisors in Action, which is a mentorship program within Site. And that's just mentoring on both sides, because as an industry as a whole, you know, we've got this next gen that we're responsible for bringing up, and yet there's so much that we can learn from them. So the peer-to-peer coaching, I think, is really important, because you can address this issue as part of that as well. And then we need to make sure we're making events a safe place to meet. So, you know, putting the code of conduct in place and some policies around how we can address that is really important. And then let's raise our expectations of professionalism. Again, it gets into, we're all in this together. We have an awesome industry. So how can we make it even that much better going forward?
Yeah, I agree. I think that raising that expectation of professionalism, the tides are turning, which I'm so excited to see. There was an article that I read last month about a summit. It was a CEO summit in San Francisco, and there was a billionaire investor that made some pretty sexist comments from stage that were very inappropriate. And 2 days later, the actual conference came out and said that he was no longer going to be attending or invited to any of the future CEO summits because of his comments. And I remember reading this and being like, I don't think that would have, number one, been the outcome a few years back, because he was a $1 billion investor. And so I'm sure they were doing some dollars and cents on, you know, do we have him back or do we slap his hand? But the tide is turning. They not only barred him from future conferences, they addressed it in the media and came out because their brand and doing these CEO summits was jeopardized by him being on stage and making these comments. So I feel like the expectations of professionalism are being raised. I think that we, as attendees, as event organizers, and as employees, and members of the community, we want better. And that's where that zero tolerance is coming in. And so I think as we expect more, and we're in this, we have to be the ones to make that change. And I think when we do, it's using some of the things that are on the slide here. Getting involved, even if it's an awkward moment, scheduling some time with maybe someone who has said something in jest, casually, or in a group that did not land well. Address it with that person if you have the relationship. I have had several peer-to-peer coaching opportunities with many people that I've worked with or volunteered with, and they have appreciated the sidebar, because they've been either from a different background or a different generation or a different country, and what they intended to say, their intent was good, but their impact was negative. And I think when we think about, you know, our actions, distinguishing between intent versus impact is really important. And I think it helps set the stage for, hey, so-and-so, I know that your intent was to be inclusive and confident on that line, and it might be inadvertently, and there's a whole, you know, there's a whole different strategy for addressing that. But when there is some inadvertent, inappropriate comments, I think saying something in the moment or later in the moment is a great way for us to elevate the industry and raise our professionalism as a whole.
So that's the end of our presentation. Are there any questions that anyone has that we might be able to address for you today?
So just a reminder, you can submit questions through the Q&A box in your Zoom toolbar. So if you do have a question for Amanda or Rhonda, now would be a time to type that in. We'll give everyone a couple seconds. I have a question, Amanda and Rhonda.
Okay.
If either event or a company does not have a policy in place for sexual harassment, are there resources available to either event planners or companies that you would recommend as a template?
You know, that's a great question. I would say, you know, from my perspective at Enterprise, I don't know if, I think our code, let's see, I think that some of our, what we call them our ethic points are on our website, but the specific policy I don't think is listed. But I know that SHRM, which is the Association for HR Managers, they might have something on there website as far as templated, if you're just starting out, or if you're a small business owner, or if you're starting an organization for you to use. I think that SHRM would probably be a great resource to go to, because they would have probably the most up-to-date templates and language that could possibly be reappropriated.
And that's something we can absolutely bring up too within the events industry sexual harassment task force. And if there's something that we can put together and pull some templates together and post out there, then we could put it on their website so people could access it there. So that's a great question, Erin. Thank you.
No problem. I don't have any other questions from the audience at this point, but I'm sure Amanda and Rhonda are available to answer any questions that you might have if you reach out directly. I want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to education@siteglobal.com, and I can help get you in contact with Amanda and Rhonda. Thank you, everyone, and a recording of this webinar will be made available within the week. So thank you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.